At a nationally televised CNN town hall in Washington, D.C., Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett confronts Kash Patel in a fiery clash over government secrecy and national security ethics. Patel strikes first, loud, relentless, questioning her qualifications and trying to paint her as out of her depth. But just minutes later, Crockett calmly reaches for a sealed folder and reveals something that flips the entire narrative on live television. What truth did she unleash that left Patel cornered, careers trembling, and America holding its breath? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The studio lights flared like floodlights on a battlefield. The CNN town hall stage gleamed in red, white, and steel gray. A polished arena built for ideological combat, not discussion. The crowd was already restless before the cameras rolled, murmurs rippling like a rising tide through the auditorium. At center stage, Kash Patel adjusted his cufflinks with the smirk of a man who believed he owned the air he breathed. "Let's be honest," he said, cutting through the room like a blade. Jasmine Crockett is a textbook case of what happens when social media stardom is mistaken for national security expertise. A sharp inhale rippled across the audience. Not surprise, but the thrill of a shot fired in cold blood. She's loud, she's flashy, but let's not pretend that qualifies someone to weigh in on matters that involve classified intelligence or life-and-death decisions. The words weren't just pointed, they were loaded, designed to detonate. On screen, his face was calm. In the room, the tension was already crackling like dry air before a storm. The audience reacted like a fractured mirror. On one side, a wave of applause and cheers erupted from the conservative section, fists pumping, smug nods exchanged like currency. But on the other, there was a different sound. Sharp exhales, narrowed eyes, and the unmistakable silence of people who'd just been insulted by proxy. Patel's posture was military clean, his delivery crisp like a man trained to dominate boardrooms and battlefields alike. "We are living in dangerous times," he said, pacing slightly, voice rising. "And the last thing we need is a performative, progressive treating defense policy like a TikTok debate." A few audience members laughed uncomfortably. Others folded their arms tighter. This wasn't just an attack. It was an ambush masked as commentary. And the woman he was targeting hadn't even stepped onto the stage yet. That silence, it wasn't absence. It was the calm before something seismic. But as the last echo of Patel's smug words faded into the heat of the studio lights, a new energy stirred behind the curtain. Steady, unshaken, and entirely unbothered by the noise outside. The announcer's voice sliced through the room. "Please welcome Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett." A single spotlight swung to stage left, and she stepped into it like a blade sliding from its sheath. No smile, no wave. Just poise wrapped in deep blue fabric and a gaze that could cut marble. Her stride was slow but deliberate, the walk of someone who didn't need to speak loudly because her presence was already doing the talking. In her left hand, a black leather folder, clean, precise, and sealed like a classified vault. It wasn't just an accessory, it was a warning. She placed it on the table with a soft thud that felt louder than any applause. And for the first time all night, Patel stopped moving. Crockett took her seat with elegance, adjusting her mic with surgical precision. She didn't fidget, didn't break eye contact with the moderator, or with Patel. Her body language was a masterclass in silent command, upright, unmoved, calm like a storm about to speak. Around her, the tension bent inward, like gravity itself had shifted. The crowd fell quiet, not out of respect, but because they sensed something they didn't expect. She hadn't come to defend herself from Patel's ridicule. She had come to indict it. And that black folder sitting next to her on the desk, it wasn't a defense. It was evidence. Loaded, locked, waiting. But just as Jasmine Crockett settled into her seat, composed, dignified, radiating a storm restrained, Kash Patel lunged forward like a man afraid of silence, hurling interruption after interruption, as if her voice itself was a threat he couldn't afford to let breathe. He didn't wait. He didn't blink. Before Crockett could fully tighten her mic or even part her lips, Patel was already hammering the table with his words. "Tell us, Congresswoman," he said, voice laced with condescension so sharp it could draw blood. What was your last direct intelligence briefing on a live threat vector? Not summaries, not filtered reports. I'm talking classified, real-time protocol decision-making. The aggression wasn't veiled. It was blatant. A blitz meant not to debate, but to dominate. He didn't give her time to answer. Didn't even pause for breath. You want to sit at this table like you're an equal, but you've never even been in the war room, have you? You've never had to carry the weight of real-time American lives on your shoulders. You've had cameras, tweets, and hashtags, not enemies and deadlines. Laughter rose from his side of the room, but it wasn't the kind that echoed confidence. It was desperate, insecure, the kind that needed volume to hide fear. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't look away. But behind her stillness was a different kind of fire. Not reaction, but readiness. Chris Wallace, the evening's moderator and veteran CNN anchor, leaned forward like a referee forced to call a foul no one else dared blow the whistle on. "Mr. Patel, please, let her speak." His tone was firm, but Patel dismissed it with a tight shrug and the smugness of a man who believed rules were for the weaker player. "The audience deserves clarity, Chris," Patel declared, his voice rising like a prosecutor delivering a final blow. "Not rhetorical gymnastics, not moral grandstanding, clarity. And that doesn't come from someone who's never held a national security clearance." The camera cut to Crockett. Her face was motionless, jaw set, but her hand twitched, just barely, near the corner of the folder. Not yet, not now. She was letting him dig. The audience was shifting. Some clapped again, others now whispered to each other, discomfort crawling across the front rows like a quiet storm. Wallace interjected again, this time louder, voice edged with authority. "Mr. Patel, I've asked you to allow a response. She will have her time." The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, but Patel pressed forward anyway, unable to stop himself. "This isn't about political correctness. This is about national security." "And frankly," he said, leaning toward Crockett with a smirk that masked the panic under his skin, "you are out of your depth." His words dropped like anvils, not to persuade, but to bury. And in doing so, he revealed his fear, that facts once spoken would render his performance meaningless. Crockett blinked slowly, not shaken, not silenced, just watching, calculating, storing every word like a fuse she intended to light when the moment demanded detonation. And just as Patel opened his mouth to strike again, Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, not in outrage, not in defense, but with the unshakable calm of someone who had brought a loaded dossier to a knife fight. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She simply placed her palm flat on the black folder beside her, as if grounding the conversation in something heavier than ego, something unshakable. "Let's start here," she said, her voice clear but measured, like the opening line of a cross-examination. "Oversight is not a talking point. It's not a campaign slogan. It is the constitutional responsibility of this body, of me as an elected member of Congress, to ensure that those entrusted with power do not abuse it." Her eyes locked on Patel like a surgeon about to make the first incision. "That responsibility includes national security, Mr. Patel, which means that your attempt to reframe me as an outsider, it's not just disrespectful, it's factually wrong." A quiet ripple moved through the audience. Not applause, not yet, but the stir of people realizing the momentum was shifting. Slowly, deliberately, Crockett opened the folder. The sound of the clasp unlocking was barely audible, but somehow it echoed. She lifted a document from the folder, its top stamped with the seal of the Department of Defense, its text dense, its authority unmistakable. "You've spoken about who's qualified, who's experienced, who belongs at this table," she said. "So let's talk about qualifications. Not mine, but yours." With a subtle nod, she signaled the production crew. Instantly, the massive screen behind them flickered to life, replacing abstract rhetoric with something no one could shout over. An official Inspector General report, projected larger than life. The room went still. "This is from June 2022, Crockett said, her voice as steady as a scalpel. "Page 47, paragraph 3. It names you, Mr. Patel, directly." She paused, not for effect, but to let the truth take oxygen. The report outlines multiple breaches of protocol regarding classified material, including unauthorized disclosures and circumventing secure communication systems. For the first time all night, Patel didn't interrupt. He didn't smirk. He didn't speak. His jaw clenched slightly, his shoulders pulled back as if bracing for impact. But the blow had already landed. Crockett continued, not gloating, not emotional, but with the quiet devastation of someone who had done the work. These aren't rumors. They're not headlines. They are findings from the Inspector General of the Department of Defense. She glanced briefly at Wallace, then back to Patel. You questioned my qualifications while sitting on a record like this? The audience was silent, motionless, caught between awe and disbelief. And Patel, who had moments earlier flooded the room with noise, now looked smaller under the studio lights, his authority flickering like a candle in wind. Jasmine hadn't just answered his attack. She had dismantled the premise behind it. But Crockett wasn't finished. What she had laid out so far wasn't the climax. It was just the scaffolding. The real weight, the part that would collapse Patel's composure entirely, was still in her hands. And she was just getting started. Jasmine Crockett lowered the first report gently onto the desk in front of her, then reached for a second document. Thicker, annotated and corner creased like it had been read many times under hard light. Let me draw your attention to what followed those security violations, she said, her tone still level but infused now with undertow. A current building, just beneath the calm. Because patterns tell us more than isolated moments ever can. She lifted the packet. This is a series of internal communications between senior staffers at the Department of Defense. Emails dated within 48 hours of the first breach being flagged. The studio lights dimmed slightly as the screen behind them flickered, displaying a cropped email chain. Portions were redacted, but enough was visible to tell a story, one of fast, suspicious personnel movements. As you'll see here, she said, laser pointing a section mid-thread, 2 employees who flagged protocol violations were reassigned within 2 days, with no formal justification on record. Their supervisors weren't informed. Their roles weren't backfilled. She paused, not theatrically but methodically, giving the audience just enough time to absorb the implication. Patel's posture had changed. He leaned back in his chair now, no longer prowling the conversation like a predator. His arms were crossed, but too tightly. His lips were pressed, but twitching. Now, Crockett continued, flipping one more page, let's pair that with this. She held up a signed affidavit. Sworn testimony from James Keller, former Deputy Director of Operations, submitted to the House Oversight Committee in March of this year. And in it, she looked directly at Patel. He claims that 3 days after the initial violations were documented, you held a closed-door meeting with senior staff. And in that meeting, Mr. Keller states under oath, you said, quote, "We need to clean house of anyone who doesn't understand how things work now." The line hit the audience like a gunshot muffled by carpet. No immediate noise, but everyone felt it. On the screen, the quote appeared in bold font, beneath Keller's notarized signature. The air in the room flattened, like oxygen had been quietly siphoned out. A ripple moved through the crowd. Not outrage, not yet, but the tightening stillness of people realizing they were watching something irreversible. Patel's jaw moved, but no words came out at first. His hands flexed on the table, as if itching for control he no longer had. Finally he spoke, but the mask was gone. "That's a fabrication," he hissed, eyes narrowed. "That meeting had nothing to do with whistleblowers. Keller had an axe to grind, and you know it." He turned to the moderator. "Chris, this is insane. She's turning standard personnel decisions into some conspiracy." But even Chris Wallace, a seasoned anchor known for navigating shouting matches and partisan meltdowns, didn't interject. His silence spoke volumes. And Crockett, sensing the weakening of Patel's center, pressed forward, not with speed, but with precision. "Mr. Patel," she said, tone never rising, "you've stood here lecturing me about what it means to understand national security. You've questioned my qualifications, my experience, and my integrity, all while sitting on documented evidence that shows retaliatory behavior, procedural violations, and a disturbing pattern of deflecting blame." Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't waver. Her body language was surgical. If what I've presented is fabricated, perhaps you'd like to explain why these records were never challenged in committee, or why the Defense Department has yet to issue any retraction. That was the line that broke him. This is a goddamn setup, Patel snapped, slamming his palm against the table. His voice cracked, raw now, stripped of its usual swagger. You're twisting facts and spinning narratives like some kind of partisan hitwoman. These are internal matters, classified personnel shifts. You don't know what you're talking about. He gestured wildly, no longer controlled, no longer precise. You've got an agenda, Congresswoman. That's all this is. And yet the more he spoke, the less the room moved with him. Where earlier he had rallied laughter and applause, now there was only quiet. The only sound was the low hum of the projector, still showing the affidavit on screen, like an unblinking witness. Wallace finally cleared his throat, his voice softer now. Mr. Patel, please, let's maintain decorum. But the moment had already slipped. Crockett turned back to the audience. Not for applause, but for clarity. Let me be absolutely clear, she said, her voice resonating through the stillness. What you are witnessing is not a performance. It is not a gotcha moment. It is a reckoning, the result of bringing facts to a stage where arrogance believed it could shout them down. She placed the affidavit beside the other documents, stacking them neatly. This isn't personal. This is accountability. Patel looked cornered now, visibly breathing harder, scanning the room for someone, anyone, to interject, to rescue him, to redirect the narrative. But no one moved. Even his own supporters were quiet, staring at the screen, the pages, the weight of it all. His face, moments earlier, smug and unbothered, now twitched with the recognition that this, the documents, the silence, the stillness, was the story being written in real time. Crockett didn't press the advantage with glee. She simply let the record speak. Calmly, devastatingly. The folder wasn't empty. The silence wasn't weakness. And her calm wasn't submission. It was something far more dangerous to a man like Patel. It was proof that she didn't need to overpower him to undo him. She just needed to be prepared. And she was. As Patel's voice collapsed under the weight of his own unraveling, and the silence grew too heavy for him to fill, Jasmine Crockett didn't need to escalate. She simply stood, not as a politician seeking attention, but as a reckoning given form. She rose with the deliberate grace of someone who understood the magnitude of the moment, someone who didn't need to fight for the floor anymore because the floor itself had surrendered to her presence. The stage lights, once harsh, now seemed to soften around her figure as she placed one hand on the table, the other resting lightly atop the stack of government-issued truths that had silenced her opponent. She didn't look rushed, didn't look angry, didn't even look triumphant. She looked resolved, and when she spoke, her voice didn't punch through the silence. It replaced it. There's something deeply wrong with the way we equate volume with value in this country, she began, her tone low, intimate, yet projected with the clarity of a bell. Some people come into rooms like this and think the person who shouts the loudest wins, that if they interrupt enough, repeat something often enough, eventually it becomes truth. She turned slowly toward Patel, her gaze not sharp, not even confrontational, just undeniable. But let me say this clearly, once and for all. The loudest person in the room is not always the right one. A stir swept through the room, a shift in posture, a stilling of restless feet, the universal silence of people leaning in. Crockett didn't press the moment for applause. She didn't ask for validation. She simply stood in the center of a storm she had refused to shout through, and reminded the room what stillness felt like when it carried purpose. I came here tonight knowing exactly how this would go. I knew I'd be dismissed, interrupted, and disrespected before I ever opened my mouth. That's not new, that's not surprising. She paused, her jaw firming as the words settled in her chest. But I didn't come here to win a volume contest. I came here to remind you that substance still matters. She stepped to the side of the table now, hand gesturing toward the glowing screen behind her. Still bearing Patel's name and the paragraph from the Inspector General's report that had gutted his defense. That document? It's not mine. I didn't write it. I didn't interpret it. I didn't dramatize it. It was written, reviewed, and released by the Department of Defense, by people who do understand national security. Her voice never broke its rhythm. And that's the difference between us. I bring evidence. You bring ego. I bring facts. You bring fury. She turned back to the audience now, her full height silhouetted against a wall of exposed truth. National security isn't something you perform. It's something you protect. It doesn't bend to personality. It doesn't yield to charisma. It requires character. There was no sound in the room but her voice and the low electric hum of the stage lights. And then she said it, the line that would cut through every replay, every highlight reel, every social media loop for the next 48 hours. National security requires ethics, not theatrics. She didn't shout it. She didn't need to. The sentence landed like judgment, a line of pure weight that dragged the room into sudden, collective understanding. For a heartbeat, the silence held. Then it shattered. Applause burst like a dam breaking, first in pockets, then sweeping across the room like a rising tide of recognition. People stood. They didn't just clap. They rose to their feet with the urgency of a courtroom reacting to a verdict too powerful to ignore. Phones came out, capturing the moment. Even those who hadn't cheered earlier now stood stunned. Some clapping, some staring in awe, all understanding that they had just witnessed something not rehearsed, but earned. The sound swelled, not celebratory, but reverent. A standing ovation, not for charisma, but for clarity. And in the middle of it all, Kash Patel remained seated, still, frozen. His hands, once animated and dismissive, were now clasped tightly together, the knuckles white with tension. He didn't interrupt. He didn't scoff. He didn't attempt to recover the narrative, because he couldn't, not anymore. His eyes, once sharp with superiority, now flicked down toward the documents. The paper trail he could no longer outrun. The very thing he had spent the evening mocking had risen like a tidal wave and buried him. He had walked in expecting a fight. But what he got was a trial and a verdict, not by vote or party or bias, but by the undeniable weight of truth, calmly delivered. As the applause softened and the lights dimmed just enough to signal the end of the confrontation, the spotlight no longer rested on the debate, but on what came next, who left broken, and who stood unshaken. Kash Patel rose from his chair too quickly, the back legs scraping across the polished studio floor like metal teeth on glass. A shrill sound that punctuated the silence he'd once filled with swagger. His face, moments ago flushed with contempt, had drained to a pale tightness around the jaw. He didn't linger. He didn't shake hands. He didn't even attempt eye contact with the moderator or the audience that had watched him crumble in real time. His footsteps echoed sharply as he strode off stage, his phone already pressed against his ear like a lifeline. "Get me Greg. Now, no delays," he muttered, his voice low but clipped with urgency, panic leaking through cracks he could no longer conceal. His staff, once clustered behind the cameras with arms crossed and smug confidence, now scrambled behind him, their faces pale, movements clipped, unsure whether to follow or disappear. A junior aide reached to adjust Patel's mic, but he slapped the hand away, the gesture swift and dismissive. His world was no longer under his command, and he knew it. The man who had walked in ready to dominate had become a man trying to escape the room before the headlines caught up with him. Behind the curtain, red light from an illuminated exit sign cast jagged shadows on the concrete floor. Patel's voice echoed faintly from the corridor, sharp and frustrated. "No, we're not waiting. We release a statement before morning. Damage control, hit her on partisanship, twist the documents. I don't care. Just bury the optics." He didn't know the cameras had picked up everything. He didn't realize the damage was already done, not just to his credibility, but to the illusion that had shielded it for years. Now it was gone, undone not by theatrics, but by quiet, methodical truth. Back on stage, the contrast could not have been starker. Jasmine Crockett remained seated, her posture still composed, the tension in her shoulders dissipating not in relief, but in resolution. She hadn't celebrated. She hadn't even smiled. The victory was not one of triumph. It was one of restoration, of reclaiming space where she'd been expected to falter. A young staffer emerged from the wings, his expression somewhere between awe and disbelief, offering her a bottle of water with both hands. She accepted it gently, uncapping it in silence, then took a slow sip. Her movements were unhurried, intentional, the same way she had conducted herself throughout the storm. Her eyes scanned the crowd briefly, not to measure applause, but to anchor herself in the reality of what had just transpired. She had not only survived the ambush, she had inverted it. Chris Wallace, who had watched the evening begin with a powder keg and end with something far more precise, approached her now with the quiet step of someone unsure whether they were speaking to a politician or a moment. "Congresswoman," he said, his voice low, softened in tone and stripped of performance. "I've moderated a lot of exchanges, but that was something else." Crockett turned toward him, her expression unreadable for a breath. Not guarded, but heavy with lived experience that no segment runtime could contain. "It wasn't about him," she said finally, placing the now half-empty bottle on the table. "It was about reminding people that the truth still matters, even when someone tries to shout over it." Wallace nodded, not out of courtesy, but in the way a man nods when the weight of what he just witnessed hasn't finished landing. For a moment, no one spoke. The studio crew lingered, their hands frozen over equipment. The control room didn't cut to commercial right away. No one moved, as if the silence itself had become sacred. And in the quiet, Jasmine Crockett sat, not victorious, not vanquished, but still, exactly where she had been all along, while the storm raged, while the accusations flew, while the air was thick with smirks and dismissiveness and noise. She had waited, she had spoken, and she had stayed. As Crockett calmly stepped off the stage, leaving behind papers, silence, and a dismantled opponent, the confrontation may have ended under studio lights, but its second life had just begun, unfolding across newsrooms like aftershocks from an earthquake no one had predicted. At exactly 8:47 p.m. Eastern, 12 minutes after the cameras cut to black, the first digital headline went live. The Washington Post didn't hesitate. Their homepage lit up with a single image: Jasmine Crockett, standing tall with her hand resting atop a stack of government reports, and beneath it, the headline, "Congresswoman Crockett flips the room in explosive national security showdown." The subtext struck harder. Freshman lawmaker delivers evidence-backed rebuke to Trump-era official, leaving town hall audience in stunned silence. Inside the article, Crockett was described as a force of discipline in the face of derision, while Patel's evening was referred to, not gently, as a collapse under the weight of unchallenged arrogance. This wasn't a recap. It was a reckoning in print. The piece included full transcripts, freeze frames of damning documents, and a minute-by-minute breakdown of Patel's unraveling. By 9 p.m., the article had been shared thousands of times across syndicates and pushed to mobile alerts as a breaking political moment. At 9:06 p.m., Politico followed, not with commentary, but with a post-mortem. Their headline read, "The receipts speak, Crockett's calculated strike at Patel redefines congressional clashes." The opening paragraph pulled no punches. In an age where outrage often overshadows truth, one congresswoman came armed not with fury, but with files. The analysis dissected Crockett's strategy like military doctrine, calling her delivery judicially precise, her tone devastating in its restraint, and her timing calculated down to the breath. Politico's writers, typically cagey with praise, made an exception this time. One senior columnist described it as the rare political moment where fact eclipses theater and preparation beats performance. The article didn't need flair. Crockett had supplied all the impact. It concluded with a chilling line. For Patel, the damage may not be his reputation alone, but the precedent this sets for anyone mistaking volume for victory. By 9:18 p.m., Reuters released a dispatch that swept wire services in over 40 countries. Theirs was cooler, stripped of drama, but no less damning. Headlined, "Congresswoman Challenges Trump-Era Official in Televised Exchange Over Classified Conduct." The piece carried the weight of neutrality like a blade. Quiet but surgical. The article confirmed the authenticity of the documents displayed on air and included quotes from senior intelligence analysts who, when pressed, admitted the revelations raised serious questions about past protocol compliance. The impact wasn't in the wording, it was in the reach. Reuters' feed pushed the story into hundreds of international outlets, from the BBC to Le Monde. Crockett's name, once regional, had gone global. What was once a confrontation had become an international headline. And then, inevitably, Fox News responded. At 9:41 p.m., their homepage changed. The headline, Stage Showdown? Crockett ambushes Patel in CNN political trap. Their article didn't focus on the documents. It barely quoted Crockett. Instead, it zeroed in on Patel's reaction, framing him as targeted by a coordinated smear effort using declassified and cherry-picked information. The piece leaned heavily on anonymous sources inside senior GOP media strategy teams, with one quoted as saying, "This wasn't debate, it was entrapment under studio lighting." On the Ingram angle, a segment aired titled Trial by Optics, How the Left Uses Theater to Manipulate Truth. It featured a selectively edited clip of Patel mid-sentence, his tone sharp, his words cut just before his outburst. There was no mention of the Inspector General's report, no images of the affidavit. Just a talking point repeated over and over. This was never about facts, it was about ambush. But the damage was done. On other networks, the narrative had already cemented. CNN's morning anchors replayed the entire segment uninterrupted. MSNBC's primetime commentary dissected it frame by frame. The Hill ran a headline by 10 p.m. Crockett's calm dismantles Patel's defense in televised firestorm. Even neutral networks like PBS and NPR covered it with quiet astonishment. The consensus was universal, even if the political interpretations weren't. This wasn't planned, but it was earned. And therein lay the injustice Crockett had faced and obliterated. She hadn't come to the town hall with the backing of legacy. She wasn't surrounded by establishment media teams or decades-long reputations. She was a first-term congresswoman walking into a trap laid by someone with years of Washington muscle and media polish. And yet, that very imbalance became the axis of reversal. The injustice of being underestimated, of being talked over, sidelined, dismissed as ornamental, had not only failed to silence her, it had become fuel. The moment she opened that black folder, the imbalance became impossible to ignore. And now, as the headlines circled the globe, the imbalance wasn't just acknowledged, it was documented. Meanwhile, conservative strategists scrambled behind closed doors. At least 3 internal memos, leaked by midnight, revealed panic. One, obtained by Axios, read, "We failed to prepare Patel for the possibility of document-based attacks. Crisis teams should begin redirecting attention to broader issues unrelated to classified handling." Another warned, "Do not allow Crockett's moment to dominate the next 48-hour news cycle. Reframe as partisan smear." But even inside the right-wing ecosystem, cracks formed. Not all were willing to carry water this time. A Republican operative told Punchbowl News anonymously, "Look, we've seen a lot of disasters, but this wasn't a slip-up. It was a tactical defeat." Crockett, meanwhile, said nothing. Her press team released no gloating statement. Her office posted no immediate video clip. While headlines clashed and networks spun, she remained silent, because she didn't need to speak. The truth had already spoken for her. As headlines hardened into legacy and political strategists scrambled to patch a bleeding narrative, something far stranger and more potent began to take shape. Crockett wasn't just being reported on. She was being canonized. It started slowly, like the early wind before a storm. A clip here, a quote there. A late-night talk show host mouthing Crockett's final line, "National security requires ethics, not theatrics," to thunderous applause. But by morning it was unmistakable. Jasmine Crockett had not merely survived a televised political crossfire, she had detonated it and walked through the smoke untouched. Her inbox was flooded before sunrise. Requests from advocacy groups, campaign bundlers, universities, even late-night programs. One email from a DC donor simply read, "More of this. Name your number." Within 72 hours, Her campaign had raised more than $1.4 million, not from super PACs, from retired teachers, from postal workers, from nurses and bus drivers and veterans who said they saw themselves in her, the clarity, the courage, the composure. Invitations rolled in like tides during a supermoon. Harvard wanted her to deliver a guest lecture on evidence-based political discourse. A bipartisan integrity committee asked her to keynote a summit in Denver. CNN extended a standing offer for commentary slots. Even Hollywood circled. A producer from a major streaming network sent a confidential inquiry. "Has anyone optioned this yet?" Her communications director laughed when she saw it, but she didn't delete it. Because by then, even Crockett knew this was no longer a one-off. She had crossed a threshold. Online, the shift was volcanic. The phrase "don't Patel this" began circulating on forums by the second evening, usually paired with a grainy screenshot of Patel's stunned expression as Crockett revealed the affidavit. Reddit threads turned it into a verb. "I almost Patel'd my presentation, but then I triple-checked my footnotes." Instagram turned it into a visual language. Patel photos with red X's, Crockett folders haloed in light. And then came the t-shirts. White block letters on black cotton, "Bring receipts like Crockett." Within 48 hours, they were selling faster than the printers could restock. But it wasn't just digital. The moment breached reality like floodwater through drywall. In an open-plan office in Atlanta, a mid-level tech team watched the town hall replay during lunch. By the final minute, someone, half joking, half awed, stood up and clapped. The others followed. In a high school civics class in Michigan, a teacher paused after showing the clip and asked, "What made her effective?" A student raised her hand and said, "She didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard." In a church group discussion in Dallas, Crockett's moment replaced the evening scripture reading. "This," the pastor said, pointing to the screen, "is what faith and truth looks like in action." Even corporate boardrooms felt the tremor. One major pharmaceutical firm held an internal seminar on evidence-based communication, with Crockett's performance cited as an ideal model for strategic de-escalation under hostile conditions. A labor union in Pennsylvania printed flyers with her image under the words, "Speak with facts, hold the line." In one viral clip, a group of nurses held up signs that read, "In healthcare, as in politics, always bring receipts." The phrase had transformed. It wasn't slang anymore. It was a new kind of mantra, but behind the glamour, behind the overnight fame, the injustice that birthed it still hummed like an electric current. Because none of it was given. It had to be fought for. Crockett had walked into that studio a target, booked to be a foil, cast as a side character in someone else's script. The moderators knew the setup. The staff had briefed Patel with pre-selected soundbites. Crockett was supposed to be background noise, acceptable, containable opposition. But she came in with more than presence. She came in prepared, and preparation was the one thing they hadn't accounted for. Now the irony was unavoidable. The woman they underestimated had become a mirror to their failure. And every time a new meme spread, every time a high schooler referenced her folder in debate club, the injustice looped back, exposed not with outrage, but with poise. That's what made it sting. Crockett never screamed. She didn't slam a fist or storm out. She proved that discipline could be more explosive than any outburst. By the fifth day, political analysts began whispering about what they once scoffed at. Could she be a national contender? One even floated the idea on live TV. I mean, if this is her first year in Congress, what's she capable of by year 6? Others dismissed it. Too soon, too flashy. But the footage kept playing, again and again and again, in airports, in classrooms, in cafeterias. The moment had seeded itself into the culture. It wasn't just Crockett's victory, it was the blueprint. And America was watching. Not because she demanded to be heard, but because she proved what happens when the ignored bring the truth. And the room has no choice but to listen. But while the public clung to Crockett's moment like a national epiphany, the halls of power pulsed with something colder: calculation, hesitation, and for some, fear. Because when a single moment rewrites the rules of engagement, Washington doesn't clap. It recalibrates. The first official response came not in the form of a speech, but a whisper, a carefully worded congratulatory post from Senator Elizabeth Warren. It read, "Integrity is not volume. Facts are not opinions. Proud to serve alongside leaders like Representative Jasmine Crockett." The subtext wasn't hard to read. Crockett had done what many veteran Democrats failed to do: face down a Trump-era operator without flinching or fumbling. Hours later, Representative Ro Khanna followed suit, stating in a live MSNBC appearance, "We've got new blood, and they don't just talk, they deliver." The praise rippled outward. Progressive groups floated the idea of placing Crockett on the Oversight Committee's intelligence subpanel. Behind closed doors, party strategists were already drawing lines around her face in campaign materials marked 2026. A junior staffer from the House Democratic Caucus admitted bluntly, "If we don't elevate her now, we're fools." But not all reactions were built on celebration. On the Republican side, a different strategy took hold: contain, but do not engage. Speaker Mike Johnson issued a short, clipped statement: "We believe in transparency and civility in public discourse. Mr. Patel remains a valued voice on national security." No mention of the documents. No comment on the substance. Representative Jim Jordan, normally a pit bull for partisan defense, chose uncharacteristic silence. Behind the scenes, however, GOP communications staff were in triage mode. Leaked messages revealed debates over how to spin the fallout. Some wanted to attack Crockett's tone. Others feared that would backfire and amplify her calm strength. "She didn't lose her cool," one aide reportedly warned in a group chat, "which makes her 10 times more dangerous." Even Fox News' internal memo, obtained by a media watchdog group, instructed on-air personalities to refer to the town hall as confrontational, not damaging, and to avoid repeating any quotes from the Inspector General's report Crockett had used. But the tremors extended further than Capitol Hill. Inside the Pentagon, red flags were quietly raised. A confidential request surfaced from the Defense Intelligence Agency, directing an internal audit of declassification protocols tied to Patel's previous tenure. A former assistant general counsel at the DoD posted a carefully worded tweet that read, "When theatrics intersect with compromised data pathways, risk doesn't disappear, it multiplies." A second source, anonymous but credible, told Politico that multiple documents Crockett referenced were already flagged in a previous investigation, but shelved due to lack of external pressure. Now, the pressure was no longer external. It was viral, it was bipartisan, and it was demanding blood. Meanwhile, a coalition of retired generals, including two who had served under both Democratic and Republican administrations, released a joint letter. It didn't mention Patel by name. It didn't have to. It emphasized the vital importance of consistency and ethical stewardship in the handling of classified materials, and warned against the normalization of reckless behavior cloaked as patriotism. Defense forums lit up overnight. On an Air Force veterans message board, one user posted, "If what she said on live TV is even 60% accurate, there are people in the system who need to start lawyering up." The pressure inside Patel's camp escalated into chaos. 3 aides reportedly walked out within 48 hours of the town hall, citing ethical discomfort and media mismanagement. One email leaked from a communications chain showed an urgent plea to a crisis PR firm. "We need an exit strategy. We cannot win this news cycle." Patel himself vanished from television. A scheduled appearance on a podcast hosted by a conservative think tank was abruptly canceled. No explanation given, no reschedule promised, and all the while Crockett said nothing. She let the system speak for her. Let the machinery she challenged begin turning inward. She had cracked the armor, and now the institutions were inspecting their own bruises. That was the deepest cut of all, not that she had shouted over her opponent, but that she had made him irrelevant while revealing the cracks he once exploited. The imbalance she endured, that of walking into a forum set against her, of being labeled a novice in a space dominated by legacy and connections, had become the foundation for a reckoning no one could mute. In one closed-door meeting of the House Intelligence Committee, a Republican member reportedly paused halfway through a briefing and said, We need to separate Cash's past access from our future credibility. No one argued, not even his own staff. As whispers hardened into investigations and the fault lines deepened across agencies and parties, Patel did what wounded men in politics often do. He ran to friendly fire, hoping it would burn differently. He appeared 3 days later on a hard-right podcast called The Patriot's Gate. The lighting was tight, colors saturated in crimson and chrome, and the host, veteran conservative flamethrower Mason Grant, was already baiting the hook before the camera even rolled. "We all saw the ambush," Grant opened. CNN, a liberal moderator, a Democrat congresswoman with a folder full of who knows what. It smelled like a setup. Patel leaned in with rehearsed indignation, his voice lower, slower, less manic than during the town hall. "That's exactly what it was," he replied. "A political hit. They framed the conversation to make me the villain before a single question was asked. It wasn't oversight. It was entrapment." He nodded confidently, as if trying to rewrite his memory in real time. "And let's be clear," he added, eyes narrowing into the camera. "This wasn't about national security. This was a coordinated attack to discredit conservatives who dare to speak bluntly. I was too effective, so they went digging for garbage, packaged it up in a fancy folder, and let the media do the rest." Grant nodded approvingly, but there was a flicker, just a flicker of hesitation behind his eyes. And then came the crack. "But Cash," Grant said slowly, rubbing his hands together like a man walking into a fire he didn't start. "You say the documents were weaponized. Okay, but just for clarity, are you saying the Inspector General's report was fake?" The pause was volcanic. Patel's eyes twitched, and his shoulders rose a fraction too high. "I'm saying it was framed," he answered, "taken out of context, leaked selectively." But the edge had dulled. The fire was no longer rage, it was smoke. The clip went viral within hours, not as a vindication, but as a backpedal in HD. The internet chewed it up. "So it's real, but not real," one user quipped under the video. Late-night shows clipped the moment with the caption, "Cash crashes in 17 seconds." Meanwhile, across the airwaves, Crockett returned, not as a warrior, but as an architect. She appeared on MSNBC's The Last Word, seated in front of the Capitol Dome, dressed in navy with a single gold pin at her collar. The tone was different now. She wasn't defending herself anymore. She was laying out a path. "What happened on that stage wasn't a takedown," she told host Lawrence O'Donnell. "It was a reckoning with truth. And the fact that truth makes people uncomfortable doesn't mean it's an ambush. It means it's overdue." O'Donnell leaned in, clearly captivated. "Congresswoman, walk us through the moment when you decided to bring classified oversight into public light, without compromising national security." She nodded, calm, composed. "We did what Congress is supposed to do. We reviewed the Inspector General's findings. We corroborated with non-classified documents. We redacted what we had to. And we followed the protocols to expose misconduct while protecting the system." Then came the pivot, sharp, principled, surgical. "But the bigger question," she said, "is why this took a viral moment for anyone to pay attention. Our system of oversight is broken. It hides behind classified whenever accountability is inconvenient. It buries whistleblowers in process. I'm calling for a full transparency reform, one that ensures the public knows when their public servants are violating national ethics under the guise of national defense." O'Donnell nodded, nearly breathless. "So you're saying this moment wasn't just about one official? It's about all of them," Crockett cut in, her voice steel-coated. "This is bigger than Patel. This is about every lie hiding behind a redacted stamp." The reaction was immediate. Progressive lawmakers began circulating her transparency proposal before the interview even ended. Twitter lit up with policy wonks dissecting every word. A retired intelligence liaison from DHS posted a rare statement. Rep. Crockett didn't just call for reform, she outlined the template, and even conservative outlets were forced to take note. The National Review ran a headline that grudgingly admitted Crockett's case for oversight, substance over showmanship. In the days that followed, the difference between the two camps became increasingly clear. Patel clung to spectacle, conspiracies, dramatics, Vague threats of lawsuits. Crockett dealt in architecture, policy, strategy. The very tools Patel once mocked her for not having. She had flipped the equation. And while he spiraled, she built. No press releases, no rage. Just structure, delivered like a scalpel to a narrative that no longer obeyed his control. But as Patel's narrative unraveled and Crockett's reforms gained oxygen, something even more enduring began to crystallize. Not just a victory, but a blueprint. And across Washington's stone halls and media green rooms, a question surfaced that hadn't been asked in years. What if truth could be rehearsed, sharpened, and deployed like a weapon? It started quietly. At first, just a few congressional interns whispering in committee prep rooms, then legislative aides shuffling printouts into the hands of their bosses with newfound urgency. A young freshman representative from Nevada entered a Veterans Affairs hearing 2 weeks later with a thick black binder marked FOIA-backed exhibits. He laid it on the table like a warning. Inspired by Congresswoman Crockett, he said, his voice steady, his tone unmistakably clear. The old ways of debating, rhetoric without receipts, fury without facts, were beginning to feel outdated. On both sides of the aisle, staffers started embedding links in talking points, cross-checking Inspector General reports, even color-coding public records to anticipate ambushes in real time. They weren't just writing speeches anymore. They were building cases. Cable pundits called it a generational shift, but the New York Times gave it a name that stuck: the Crockett effect. Above a photo of Jasmine Crockett at the CNN town hall, folder open, eyes locked, silence weaponized, they printed the headline, "She didn't yell, she proved." Overnight, the phrase exploded. From Capitol Hill to law schools to corporate workshops on political communication, the Crockett effect became shorthand for something rare: victory through evidence, not ego. NPR's Morning Edition ran a segment titled "The New Rules of Political Engagement," featuring clips of Crockett layered over a string quartet and voiceovers explaining how her performance rewired public expectations. Not louder, just smarter; not wilder, just more prepared. Within weeks, the ripple spread beyond politics. At George Washington University, a political science professor rewrote his syllabus. Chapter 14, Argumentation in the Age of Optics, was renamed Chapter 14, The Crockett Doctrine. Debate clubs from Texas to Oregon began circulating bootleg transcripts of the town hall like contraband scripture. Students memorized Crockett's phrasing, rehearsed the moment she laid down the sworn whistleblower statement. One debate coach even created a new exercise, the folder drop drill, teaching students not just how to make an argument, but how to time it, deliver it, and own it like Crockett did on live television. Meanwhile, Capitol Hill communications consultants, once focused solely on image, posture, lighting, pivoted hard. Slide decks now opened with receipt-based messaging strategy, the Crockett framework. Clients were told, if you can't show it, don't say it. Even high-level consultants who previously dismissed documentation as wonkish baggage began coaching senators on how to weaponize footnotes. The new mantra in war rooms wasn't stay on message, it was bring the files. But while the effect thrilled rising leaders, it unsettled the establishment. Several veteran lawmakers grumbled privately that the new trend risked turning every hearing into a courtroom circus. This isn't a deposition, one senator scoffed to Politico, it's governance. But that was precisely what made Crockett's style dangerous, because it was governance. It was constitutional duty sharpened with 21st century tools, and it didn't ask permission to be effective. It didn't need seniority, it needed proof. And the public, especially the disillusioned, the forgotten, the digitally fluent, recognized it instantly. Not just as competence, but as justice made legible. Late-night hosts mocked the backlash, airing a viral skit, an actor playing an old-school politician sputtering through a debate, while a faux Crockett calmly rolls in a dolly stacked with government binders. I brought charts, she says. You brought vibes. The real Crockett, meanwhile, stayed quiet. She didn't take a victory tour. She didn't chase the spotlight. Instead, she returned to her office and submitted a proposal to the House Rules Committee for mandatory digital public access to declassified oversight reports. No cameras, no fanfare. Just systems, being rebuilt, one receipt at a time. When asked in a brief hallway interview what she thought about the phenomenon named after her, she shrugged. "I didn't try to start anything," she said. "I just refused to come unarmed." By now, the headlines had faded into the digital archives, and the viral clips began their slow descent into the rearview mirror of political memory. But long after the studio lights dimmed and the applause was archived, one truth remained. Not about Crockett or Patel, but about something bigger. What it takes to cut through the chaos of an era addicted to distortion. In an age where noise ruled, where the loudest voice often drowned out the most accurate one, Jasmine Crockett didn't just speak. She executed. She didn't perform for the cameras. She didn't brandish anger as a strategy or volume as a substitute for values. She carried truth into battle like a soldier might carry a final bullet. Not for show, but for survival. And when she laid that truth on the table, not screamed, not leaked, but verified, timed, and televised, she did more than defend herself. She broke the spell. The one that said being aggressive meant being right. The one that taught us to measure conviction by fury, not fact. Crockett's silence between interruptions wasn't hesitation, it was discipline. Her steady gaze wasn't defiance, it was control. In a format designed for chaos, she was stillness. And in that stillness, she made something devastatingly clear. Truth still works when delivered with precision, not panic. When timed like a scalpel, not hurled like a grenade, and when voiced by someone who does not fear consequences, but understands them. That's why her performance struck deeper than a viral win. It wasn't just what she revealed. The Inspector General's report, the retaliatory documents, the whistleblower's sworn statement, it was how she revealed it. She made preparation look like power. She made documentation feel like a weapon. And she made millions reevaluate a dangerous myth, that the best debater is the one who yells the loudest. Even her harshest critics, left fumbling in the wreckage of spin, could not erase the core truth of what unfolded on that stage. Crockett didn't simply win the confrontation. She rewrote the criteria for what winning even meant. It wasn't about gotcha moments. It was about governing moments. It was about turning oversight into action and cameras into courtrooms, where the public could witness real accountability, not theatrical stunts. And so her legacy wasn't the applause. It wasn't the trending hashtags or the glowing editorials. It was a shift in posture. Young staffers now walked into briefings with folders, not slogans. Town halls suddenly felt less like cage matches and more like depositions. And somewhere in the subtext of every media appearance, every press conference, every hearing, her shadow loomed, quiet, prepared, and ready. That shift, quiet but irreversible, was what made the Crockett effect not just a moment, but a mutation. Political DNA changed. Suddenly, a rising generation of leaders understood that facts weren't cumbersome, they were nuclear. And if delivered correctly, with timing, tone, and calm, they could obliterate months of spin in a single sentence. Crockett's sentence was simple. National security demands ethics, not theatrics. It wasn't screamed. It wasn't dressed up. But when she said it, an entire room stood. And one man went silent. Behind the curtain, aides at multiple federal agencies were already revising internal playbooks. The Office of Congressional Liaison quietly recommended that department heads review IG reports for vulnerabilities prior to public testimony. Think tanks cited her exchange in discussions about how to train diplomats. Private sector boards even hosted strategy sessions based on her cadence, her calm assertiveness in the face of confrontation. What she modeled wasn't just courage, it was a system, and once seen, it could not be unseen. For months after, her speech was dissected like case law. Professors screened the town hall alongside classics like the Army McCarthy hearings and Anita Hill's testimony. But unlike those past moments, Crockett didn't rely on public sympathy or personal narrative. She relied on receipts. She didn't beg to be heard. She made silence impossible. And because of that, the aftershocks weren't just political, they were institutional. People began to ask, What happens when emotional clarity meets procedural mastery? The answer, it turned out, was Crockett. She became a case study, not in personality, but in execution under fire. Her victory wasn't cinematic because it was explosive. It was cinematic because it was surgical. She let her opponent overplay his hand, let the room build tension, let the viewers lean forward, and then, at the moment when bluster reached its highest pitch, she opened a folder and detonated restraint. Not chaos, not revenge, but consequence. And in doing so, she didn't just finish an argument. She ended an era. The age of empty outrage had met its match. Years from now, students of law and leadership will still be watching that clip, pausing it, rewinding it, studying the twitch of her hand before she turned the first page. And in every setting where spin threatens truth, someone will whisper, "Bring the folder." It won't be about paperwork, it'll be about readiness. The kind that doesn't fear the truth, but prepares for it. The kind that doesn't perform for applause, but for impact. That is what Jasmine Crockett left behind. Not a moment of dominance, but a methodology of clarity. A new archetype for the political warrior. Not the loudest, not the flashiest, but the one whose calm was crafted, whose argument was armed, and whose victory was not shouted, but delivered with such deliberate weight that silence became the loudest sound in the room. And in that silence, a new standard was born, one that will echo far beyond that studio stage, but beyond the headlines, beyond the viral clips and replays dissected by pundits and professors alike. Something deeper lingered, something not about performance or strategy, but about the quiet, burning lesson that every injustice, every dismissal, every interruption had etched into the soul of that moment. A lesson not just for politics, but for life. The most devastating moments in history aren't always the loudest. Sometimes the sharpest revolutions happen not when someone screams, but when someone refuses to lower their voice. That's what Jasmine Crockett proved, not just with her facts, not just with her evidence, but with the unshakable stillness of someone who has been underestimated her entire life and still chose not to flinch. What made her victory human wasn't the folder she held. It was the decades she carried in silence before that folder ever touched her fingertips. The years of being told she was too emotional, too young, too loud, too black. The rooms where her intelligence was questioned before she ever spoke. The panels where her resume was ignored, and her tone dissected more than her argument. And still, she showed up, and she waited, and she prepared. It's easy to believe that the world changes through explosion, but Crockett taught us that change also comes through patience, through documenting what they think you'll never find, through listening longer than they expect, through holding back until the exact second the lie collapses on its own weight. It's a lesson forged in every woman who's had her ideas stolen in a meeting, in every whistleblower told to stay silent for the good of the institution, in every underdog who was told to wait their turn, but knew that turn would never come unless they made it. In that moment, Crockett didn't just take her turn. She created the conditions that made denying it impossible. And yet, even as the nation cheered, the human cost remained unspoken. Because for someone like her, the fight isn't just for a moment, it's daily. Every word she said that night had to be perfect. Every fact had to be verified, every document sourced, every sentence measured. Because one misstep would have been weaponized, not just against her, but against every woman who looked like her, every outsider who dared to speak. Her margin for error wasn't narrow, it was non-existent. That's the part most people missed. Her victory wasn't just impressive, it was required for survival, and she pulled it off anyway. That's where the lesson lives, not in the applause, but in the pressure she endured to earn it. In a world that often confuses cruelty with strength and noise with truth, she modeled a rare form of resistance, grace under fire. She didn't need to shout to be powerful. She didn't need to mock to be memorable. She didn't need to destroy someone's dignity to defend her own. She came armed with something infinitely rarer: integrity backed by evidence and ethics shaped by struggle. And that, in the end, is the human core of what happened. It wasn't a political triumph. It was a moral calibration, because it told us something we'd forgotten, that truth doesn't have to shout to win, that composure isn't weakness, It's courage with its back straight. That when the odds are rigged, when the stage is stacked, and when even the host hesitates to interrupt the aggressor, you can still win by staying ready, not bitter. By choosing the moment, not reacting to the bait. By being the keeper of the truth, not just the target of the narrative. In Jasmine Crockett's silence before she spoke, there was a lesson. In her precision when she did, there was a blueprint. And in the moment Patel realized he couldn't shout her down, there was a reckoning. She didn't just bring receipts. She brought the reminder that in a world of orchestrated distraction, truth still cuts through, if delivered by someone who dares to carry it to the front lines and doesn't blink. That's the story that stayed long after the credits rolled. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.